The book of the week from last week that I'll talk about tonight was a fascinating book. I really can't recommend it highly enough. I'll tell you the name of it and then I'll rave about it a bit more. But it is Work by James Suzman. Work, A Deep History from the Stone Age to the Age of Robots by James Suzman. And it was really a fascinating book. Really a book that makes you think and rethink about the ways we approach something so fundamental as work in our life, in our society, and in our own daily lives. And to me, it was really made me think about things in lots of ways that I'll talk about tonight, and really makes you become aware of the history of something. And so when we look at the history, one of the things people commonly say, which is very true, is that we need to understand, we need to know our history so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, which is very true. We need to understand what's happened because we can repeat the mistakes, of course, even learn from the things that did go well. Very often similar types of things repeat in history. So the more we understand what has happened in the past, the better we can make sure we don't repeat those same mistakes. Sometimes we might think, hey, we should try this. And then we look in history and we see people have tried that before and it failed miserably, or was really bad, or maybe actually went well. And so we can, learn from that past. So that's very important. But another reason it can be so important to understand our history is to understand how we got to where we are today, and also to understand that it didn't have to be the way it is, the way things are now. So that even though we might say, well, this is the world, this is the natural order of things, very often we feel that way because the systems seem so clearly there. But when we look at how we got to where we are, we can recognize it doesn't have to be this way. It didn't have to be this way, and it wasn't always this way. And so in this description of the history of human beings and even really other animals, when it comes to this concept of work, James Suzman does a great job of helping to explain and to give some understanding to the history of work throughout human history. So to me, it was fascinating, and I really enjoyed it. So, even if we look at this concept of work, we have a lot of connotations. When we hear work, we tend to think of a job, something that we make money. For a lot of people, something they don't want to do, or we try to avoid if we can. And all those things might be true for many of us in today's society. But if we try to understand what work even is, essentially it's what we do, or any organism does, to get the energy it needs to survive, or to do something for survival. And I'm reminded of in Mark Solm's book, when he, in The Hidden Spring, talking about consciousness and looking at feelings, one of the things he talked about in relation to this work idea is that when we get out of homeostasis, that's a demand for work to get back to homeostasis, get back to the set point we want to get to. But looked at in also another way, which relates to that, is that work is something we do to get the energy we need to survive. And so we see this in all living beings. Even bacteria in some ways have to do work. They do different things at different times to survive. But of course, as beings get more complex, we have to do more to be able to fuel our bodies and to survive. But also, the bigger we get, the more things we can do, and the more intelligent we get, the more ways that we can do them. But in this fundamental way, work is this type of function to do something, to exert some energy, to actually get more energy in some way. And also related to The Hidden Spring, the theme of empathy, or the concept of empathy, was discussed in this book, that we're trying to capture energy in a way, and in order to do that, it would take some work. So we need work to survive, to capture energy, to do the things we need to do. And if we think about human beings, we tend to think, well, that's why we do everything that we're doing, which is kind of true. But what's interesting is James Suzman has spent years, or has spent in the past, I'm not sure currently he is, but living amongst hunter-gatherer tribes or communities that are still around in southern Africa. So he has spent time with what we think or believe, or how our ancestors lived. So this is, again, James Suzman, the author of the book Work that I'm talking about tonight. So he spent time with them and saw how they lived. And when he looked at how much time they spent in what we might consider work, the type of work needed to survive, to provide the fuel they needed to live, he saw that the adults were typically doing about 15 hours a week in order to do what was necessary to survive. So 15 hours a week. And for me, this is quite fascinating because oftentimes when we think about hunter-gatherer tribes, or we think about our ancestors living in the in the savannah trying to survive, we tend to think of this story of individuals who are barely making it and constantly on the cusp of not surviving or surviving, and all of them, so many of them dying because they didn't have enough to eat. And what he saw was nothing of that sort. They were very comfortable. They were not actually very anxious or stressed about having enough food to eat to survive. They did essentially 15 hours a week, and they were able to make it quite well. And to me, that was eye-opening to realize that or recognize that. I'd heard some things like that, but maybe not in as much detail as he described here, that are, from myself, I can say, this misconception that we had to work so hard to survive, which is why we still work, 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week. It's not true. So it's not this natural human tendency. So again, because things are so entrenched in our way of life now, we can often think that this is just the way humans have always been. This is the way it has to be. If we don't work 40 hours a week, it's not natural. It's not going to be okay. But what he saw was essentially that the current hunter-gatherers, which essentially is probably what most of our ancestors lived before urban types of development, agriculture, things of that sort, they didn't have to work so incredibly hard to survive. They had more time to do other things, to interact with each other, to tell stories to each other, all types of things like that. So to me, that was very interesting. I think important to look at, okay, how did we get to where we are? Because it's quite puzzling. And so he talks about how for some people studying these hunter-gatherer groups, they actually said these were the first affluent society, because they were living comfortably. They had enough. They were living essentially in abundance. So again, it puts on its head this misconception many of us can have that hunter-gatherers, they were barely surviving. They were making it. And it also introduces this concept of what does it mean to be affluent, which is quite interesting. Because usually when we think of being rich or poor, we think about having, let's say, a lot of money or not having a lot of money, or having assets and things like that. But really, when we think of what it means to be poor, it just means that you don't have as much as you would want to have, or you have these wants that are not met based on your material needs. But what he found, and what others have found, is that these individuals are quite happy and okay with what they have. Now, they might not have this iPhone I'm using currently to be on Instagram Live and all this other technology we think of as so important, but they are quite comfortable and happy with what they have. So who is the impoverished ones? They who are happy with what they have, or most of us who think we need and want more constantly because of what we've created in our civilization now? So that's a very interesting, for me, an interesting point to consider when we look at how we live life and how things are, that it doesn't have to be this way. And so he does discuss various issues and factors that contributed to things like agriculture coming about. And that's a big turning point in human history, because also in these hunter-gatherer types of societies, there isn't a lot of surplus. They hunt, and they hunt enough, and they eat it, and they're fine, and everyone gets some of the meat, and they're okay, and they'll hunt again next time, and they have other foods that they eat as well, but they don't store anything. So there isn't this sense of trying to get more, because there's no need for it. And they're very strongly egalitarian, and egalitarian means things are equally distributed. So there's a strong sense of egalitarianism in these types of societies, which again to me is a sign of advancement, morality. We tend to think of oftentimes the primitive people of these types of, hunter-gatherers or our ancestors as more primitive than us. But to me, who's the more primitive one? the group that has so much more, yet has many of its citizens not doing well and barely surviving or not surviving from not having enough, or another society where everyone is taken care of. To me, we would be primitive in a moral sense compared to them. And so everyone was doing okay. He actually said there were some interesting things, people, we think about cultural customs that always are going to exist. And some of the groups he lived in, he talked about how to make sure no one got a big head or felt too good about themselves in the way of putting themselves above others, there was this way of belittling the hunt, or I forgot what it was called, but basically making fun of the hunt. So if someone brought a giraffe, rather than being, oh, this big giraffe, it's going to have so much meat for us, they would talk it down in a kind of almost a playful way, but teasing it that, I think that's the smallest giraffe I've ever seen, or I don't know if that's going to be in enough food. I heard him doing an interview for my mother-in-law. He said, someone joked something like that. So it's this sense that they wanted to make sure that egalitarianism is almost, they were in a sense vigilant about it, or very aware that you don't want any one person to get too full of themselves, even if they get too much stature or status in the community. So they were almost aggressively, in a way, keeping that egalitarianism. But so with the advent of agriculture, it also created this possibility for surplus. And what we also saw happen in this transition is we went from almost everyone sharing the work. But once we got into agriculture and things started to change, and slowly then it took some time, but then developed into cities, it was that few people were doing most of the manual labor or the work that it took to provide the food, and lots of other people, and sometimes it's a small portion, didn't have to work at all. So we saw not just an unequal distribution of wealth, but we also started to see an unequal distribution of work in the hard work, which we still see today. But that started to become possible where you had people who were farming, and maybe it was many of the people, and then there's some people that were elites for whatever reason, and they didn't have to work. And so this brought to mind, when I was reading this aspect or these parts of the book, a wonderful book I read last year by Thomas Piketty, Capital and Ideology, where one of the main theses of that book was that throughout history, really more recent human history, based on what this book is talking about, but in this recent few thousand years plus, there's always been great inequality, where most people didn't have a lot, or a lot of people didn't have a lot, and then a few had a lot as far as wealth, power, status, comfort, all that. And always throughout history, there were justifications, or these ideologies, thus the title of the book, to justify why things were actually, it's funny, justify why things were so really unjust, to try to make it seem fair. Well, these are the descendants of God. The kings have been descendants of God, so of course they have to be treated this way. We can't, do anything else. Or these people are from a special caste, in certain, let's say, Indian cultures, or there's some reason why this inequality actually makes sense, or it has to be this way. But unfortunately, we can see that there's always a bogus reasoning to it, and even currently, we still have that. One of the ways we see it now, we still have some of these types of elite, inborn ways of being elite, but also the myth of meritocracy. Now, I'm not arguing that there's no meritocracy in the world, meaning that nothing, or no amount of wealth or success is due to people working harder or doing better things. Of course, there is some of that. But the degree of the inequality cannot be justified by merit alone, that these people are working that much harder or are contributing that much more to the world to have so much more than others. I think in the book he cited a statistic, something like, I believe, was it the 1% had 45% of the wealth, something like that. 1% of the human population right now owns 45% of the wealth. So I don't think anyone could argue that this is something based on merit alone. The system itself has considerable issues. Now, I'm just kind of scratching the surface with this book, and because, as I said, it's so fascinating, interesting, I want to continue the discussion. So after the break, I'll talk some more on the book Work by James Suzman. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Continuing the discussion on the book Work by James Suzman. Work, a deep history from the Stone Age to the age of robots. So before the break, I was talking about how with the advent of agriculture, we saw some pretty big changes in society, in the sense that now we could have accumulation of wealth, we could store things for the future, but that created its own issues that led to the lack of egalitarianism, or this inequality, which continues to this day. But it also started to create these trends about how we work and how much we work. So it's interesting to think that hunter-gatherers need 15 hours a week to take care of themselves. But most of us now, if I say you work 15 hours a week, people will say you're being lazy or not working hard, and a whole bunch of other things. Even this concept of work, I think, is an interesting thing to consider, because he even includes, when he talks about work, it's not just getting food a lot of the times. It's also including things like what we might consider chores, taking care of certain things, taking care of kids, and things of that nature. I think what unfortunately has also happened is the things we prioritize have become backwards in a way. So we think about work as the most important thing, and then we have to fit everything else in, right? So, okay, you need to have this job, and then you have to work this many hours a week, and then find a way to take care of your kids. Or as a society, let's try to find ways to take care of the kids, but the work can't change, or the ways that we work can't change. And you would almost hope it would be the other way around. Let's take care of the kids and make sure children are okay, and get the parental care they need, and the supervision they need, and the education they need, and then let's work everything around that, those basic things, those values. And that's something that, again, reading this book and seeing that in human history we've created the world we live in now. It's not just based on natural things. Yes, there's a lot of natural forces at play, but to think that the world as it is today has to be how it is today because of something natural is definitely not the case. I think there's a quote by Nelson Mandela, something about, I think, poverty is man-made. Something like that. But nonetheless, I should have said it without knowing it, but I totally agree with that the poverty that we see existing in today's society is not some natural thing that people have to be so poor and some people so rich. Absolutely not. Again, hunter-gatherer tribes who are still alive, and previous generations or previous ancestors did not have this extreme type of discrepancy. So it's not some natural, innate thing of being human that we need these extremes. And sometimes the argument to that is, you think everything should be perfectly equal exactly? No. So it's not a black or white thing, but we don't need extremes of inequality. Don't make sense. So again, when we have a surplus of things to survive, and some people are still not having enough and they die because of a lack of having those things, we should be very upset about that. That should not be okay. We should not accept that. And so that's what I think is, for me, important to keep in mind, is the world we live in, although it seems so real in the sense that it has to be this way, it doesn't have to be this way. When we see the history, we see that that's not the case. So when we look at the advent of agriculture, then slowly that led to cities. I won't get into all of the details of that, and I probably can't do it, obviously, as well as the book will do it, so I hope you will read the book. This started to change the ways that we related to work, and also the field of economics started to come about around this time, when there was scarcity. And so that was actually one of the problems that economics was trying to figure out, was this issue of scarcity. How do we overcome it? And that's what a lot of economic theory comes from, is focusing on scarcity. And so he even gets into that economics, in a way he does, I want to say talk bad about it, because that's not true, but some of the assumptions that it seems that economists have, or economic theory has, he does challenge, and I think rightfully so, to be aware of how we value things. Because what started to, I've talked about this before, and my brother Parham, PhD in economics, so he always is teaching me, but sometimes I give him my novice theories of certain things. But one of the things I think is really negative about the field of economics is that money, things like, and also GDP, but money becomes the most important thing. So if you do something and you get less money out of it, you are being irrational. Cass Sunstein wrote, I think he is a behavioral economist, but who's one of the authors of the next book. But you're irrational if you do something that makes less money, because money is somehow the most important thing. Now, I know they'll talk about utility and other things that are important as well. But there's a way that money became this most important of things, and everything. If you could have more of it, then you should keep having more of it. And I talked about this recently, that if I tell you someone in their home has thousands of newspapers in their house from 30 years ago, they have everyone still, and it's all over the place, or they keep them in some garage even, and they have all these, you're going to say, oh, this person's a hoarder, they have a big mental issue and a big problem, because they have all this stuff that they don't need. It's a waste. But if someone has $300 billion, we praise them and we put them on the covers of magazines and make a list of who are the richest people in the world. But in a way, there is something similar there. They have all this wealth, something that they can't even use and do anything with. So they're hoarding money, but because, again, money has been given this type of exempt function or status that more money is always good no matter what, we praise these people, we celebrate them, and everyone thinks they should aspire to be the richest person in the world. And so because of that, we actually praise these people, that we can even say, well, why do you need so much of those things? Again, if people are dying and you have some things, shouldn't we rethink how we're doing things? And of course, for all of us, many of us, myself included, have more than I need. Shouldn't we be taking care of others? But so it's some things to think about, how we prioritize things, what we celebrate in our world, and how at times it could be very sick and unhealthy what we praise and how we look at things. When we talk about work and issues with work, we can talk about being a workaholic. And that came up in the book too. People who have literally in more modern times worked themselves to death. And he shared some stories about those types of people, which gives us an insight into how we work ourselves literally to death because we think that that's the most important thing and the only thing that matters. And being a workaholic, of course, there's individual factors as well. Sometimes people, in a way, unconsciously or consciously choose to be a workaholic because they don't want to face other parts of life. So in a stereotypical way, traditionally, that the man who stayed at the office because he didn't want to come home to his wife and kids, not just because he had to work or wanted to be at work. That at times is happening, but also we live in a society where if you're working at some kind of places 60, 70 hours, you have to show that you're working more than the other people to get ahead, this kind of competitive landscape. But really, it's very sick and unhealthy the ways that we are working. So that was also brought up in the book, which I think is an important point of how we are working. I did want to also add the parts about what's going to happen in the future. So in the title, it says from the Stone Age to the age of robots. And this is something that people have written a lot about. Many great thinkers have been thinking about this big issue of, as we move into the world where automation replaces many jobs, and in that sense replaces many workers, what's going to happen? What are people going to do? There's some estimates that, depending on which ones you look at, 30% of jobs, 40% of jobs, huge chunks of the jobs that people are currently doing at a certain point in the near future can be replaced by robots or AI or different types of technology, and there will no longer be a need for humans to do them. And I think it is important for us to ponder these questions and prepare and to be aware that this is going to happen. I do have an optimistic outlook because some of that mindset that creates that anxiety about what's going to happen, again, in some level, rightfully so, it comes from this notion that people should be working 40 hours a week. So do we have enough things for people to do to work 40 hours a week? So I think that can change the amount that people work. I think he talks about Keynes and how he was saying in some utopia in the future, when we are able to take care of our basic needs, people won't have to work as much. And he actually, I think without knowing about hunter-gatherers, said 15 hours a week would be the typical work week. So I think that will hopefully start to change. I also think there are so many, sectors when we're talking about like workplace, but there's so many job sectors that require human beings. And of course, with technology advancing, maybe even some of them can be replaced. But there are human to human types of ways that people can connect or need help. So one of the ways that I think is very important is individuals, for example, who have disabilities or some special needs where they can use or even need some types of assistance to get through their days. And they need a human to do that, or humans to do that. Maybe, people work different shifts. But that's one example of the type of a job that already exists. But I think why not have even more people filling these roles, or even doing more to support those who maybe need some type of an assistance, let's say, or different ways of human-to-human contact. So I think, yes, there'll be robots that can talk to people and do all sorts of types of things, but human relationships will still be fundamental and foundational to how we live. And this goes back to this concept of work. As I mentioned, we could look at work as how you capture energy to then survive or to expend that energy in different ways. But if we take a step back and just think of what do we value as human beings, what do we want society to look like, we could think that there's lots of work, so to speak, quote unquote, that we've been neglecting, some of which I mentioned earlier. Things like childcare and allowing parents to be with their children. So if we can take care of the basic necessities more easily, if machines can take care of certain jobs, well, I think that would be a great time for us to use that surplus time that we would now have, this extra time that was not available, the manpower or woman power that we have, to focus on human relationships, human connections, and that aspect of life that I think we've neglected. And so to me, there's an interesting kind of circle, pardon the Lion King type of pun, circle of life that we've experienced. So the hunter-gatherers that I was describing that are still alive, but if we look at the ancestors in a lot of societies where we're no longer hunter-gatherers, they spent time with each other. And so if they only needed about 15 hours to procure what they needed and to take care of gathering food and doing all of the chores and things of that nature, well, they had a lot more time to connect and to be together. But then we thought we were advancing with the technology that we were doing, but actually because of the ways we advanced and the problems that created, we actually made it so we had less time to connect and to be with one another, which is very sad. And so that's what we've experienced for a lot of more modern human history, that we've had less time to be with loved ones, to be together. For childcare, there's been times in last 100, 200 years where, children should just be raised all together in some orphanage or somewhere away from their parents because they don't need to be close to them. Now we know that's very not true, but we've created a world where those things have not been the priority. And I hope that we will shift our priorities and recognize if we have more time, it's not going to be wasted, because what is work is really taking care of one another, or getting to the business of being human is work. When we think of what we should be doing, we should be connecting with one another, having parents able to spend time with their children, long periods of time, especially when they're babies and as they're growing up. We can create that world. I know it sounds very much like a utopia and idealistic, but to me it's very possible and very realistic as well, that we can move towards that and realize, but it would take some huge shifts in how we view things, and also huge shifts in people who have power relinquishing some of the power that they currently have in the way that things are set up, to see that we are prioritizing things wrong, that we can reimagine human society in lots of ways. And that I hope that as we come full circle, will allow technology to again allow us to spend more time with one another, to connect with our loved ones, to be with our families, to get to the real work of being human, which is connecting with one another. And so I hope the pandemic, of course it's been tragic in the lives that have been lost and all the other casualties that have happened because of it. So it's not something that we wanted in any way. I do hope that when we rush back to normal with things opening up, vaccines making it so people can get back to the way things were, we also consider the things we don't want to be that same way. on an individual level, but a societal level as well. Should we rush back to people being in offices 50, 60 hours a week and away from families when that's not necessary? Should we rush back to the inequalities, which got worse actually during the pandemic, and not recognize how unhealthy that is? Then when we have to fight a disease, in this case all together, we can come together for the well-being of others, even if we might feel like we're sacrificing in some way. But doesn't that really make sense in making a better world for everyone? So I hope we will consider and reconsider some of these things. And I know it can sound like a utopia and unrealistic and an idealistic type of way of looking at things, but really I don't think it is that idealistic, and I'm fairly certain that at some point in the future we will get there. I just hope we will do the work to make that happen sooner rather than much later.